Are you ready?
Yes.
I'm ready too.
Yes. Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for coming to today's Minds, Technology and Society seminar. Our speaker, great pleasure in introducing Professor Mary Peterson from the University of Arizona, where she is Professor of Psychology and also the Director of the Cognitive Science program there. Mary is an expert in the kind of vision research I really like, which takes this really unique approach that vision is not a one-way street. There are very important connections that happen from top down, bottom up, east to west, which is what makes the problem as gnarly as it is and as interesting as it is. Professor Peterson is, in addition to being an extraordinary vision scientist, she's also done a lot for the promotion of cognitive science. She has been heading, she founded Women in Cognitive Science.
No, not Women in Cognitive Science.
She founded Phobia.
Phobia.
But she's also been very involved in Women in Cognitive Science.
Yeah.
Both are programs that exist to diversify cognitive science at large. And in addition to that, I actually also gathered today that she's been mentoring a lot of scholars, especially women scientists in various universities in North America. So, but without further ado, please welcome Professor Mary Peterson, and you can see the title of her talk.
Thank you, Ramesh. I'm really having fun visiting this cognitive science program. And I should just tell you what phobia means. It is females of vision et al. It's an acronym. And so the et al means we're very happy to include men, and we think we should have to include men if we're going to solve this problem. But we're out to mentor females in vision and ensure their success. Okay, without any more ado, I want to ask you to just take a look at some silhouettes I'll show you on the screen. They're going to go by very quickly. Just watch them as they go by. Okay, thank you. I'm not going to say any more about them for a little while. I'll ask you about them much later in my talk. Just to give you a background for my talk, a very challenging task for the visual system is to determine, for borders in the visual field, are they bounding contours of objects, or are they just part of a pattern? Are they an edge of a three-dimensional object? You don't have any insight into this being a difficult problem until you look at an image like this. And now you can see it is a difficult problem. And in fact, this is how zebras stay alive. Their predators cannot separate one zebra from another when they travel together in a herd like this. Here's a more fanciful example that you may be familiar with from the web. And here, there is an articulated contour separating a face portion of this display from the whitish region on the side. And if you assign that articulated contour to the face side, you see a profile of a man facing to the right. And the white region adjacent to it is shapeless. It appears to just continue behind that man's profile. But if instead you assign that articulated border to the white region, you see a face of a man looking straight on at you with half of his face occluded by this funny shaped screen. So where you assign the border determines where you see shape. The portion of the face that is occluded by this articulated screen is shapeless right near the border, although you know it continues behind. So this decision of what regions do borders belong to tell us where the shaped entity lies in the scene. So the question I'm interested in is, how is this decision, figure ground perception, how is it accomplished? And is it special? I have been working on it my whole career, but is it special? And the big question really is, how does object perception occur? So here's an outline of what I'll do. I'll give you a brief history of thinking about figure ground perception. For many years it was considered part of a serial feed-forward process of vision. And then I will tell you about some experiments from my lab that show that object memories are activated before figure assignment, and that counteracts that serial view of perception. And we formed a hypothesis based on these early experiments. The hypothesis was that multiple object possibilities are generated before any object is perceived. And this happens outside of awareness. So I'll show you some evidence that it does indeed happen outside of awareness. These possible objects compete in our framework. I'll show you some evidence that they do, both behavioral and neural evidence. And then I'm going to wrap this all up in a predictive processing framework and show you some evidence for feedback in the visual system involved in the perception of these objects. And then I'll close by telling you figure ground segregation is not special. So let's go through this. So we think about figure ground perception, we think of where the shaped entity lies with respect to a border. So this was designed so that you would see the shaped entity as the face there on the right side of the screen. And it was long thought, after the Gestalt psychologists had their input, that the visual system first decided where the shaped entities lay with respect to borders before object memories were accessed at all. So how did it decide? It used what you learned as Gestalt cues, things like symmetry, convexity, small area, enclosure, etc. Better to think about them as priors rather than as cues. But the thinking was that first, using those low-level priors, the visual system determined where the figure lay with respect to the border. And it was only after that figure assignment happened that the figure only was passed forward to object memories. And so object memory access happened after figure assignment. And this was a very, very popular point of view once the Gestalt psychologists made this argument. Why? I think there are many reasons. Humans prefer to think in terms of serial processes, first this and then that. Secondly, it's parsimonious. People would say things like, well, why attempt to recognize an object where you're just going to see a shapeless region in the end? So it's much more parsimonious to do figure ground segregation first. And finally, it was computationally tractable. Many computational modelers said, oh, the brain just can't do all of that processing before object perception. This traditional serial feed-forward view is still present in many current models. Here's a current model that uses aspects of the visual system to do object recognition. So what you see here are the various layers in the ventral visual stream, V1, V2, V4, posterior inferior temporal cortex, PIT, anterior inferior temporal cortex, AIT. We're pretty far along in the ventral stream now. And finally, the frontal cortex. And the theories were that you first extract the features that V1 can respond to, oriented bars, and then you extract more complex aspects, more complex features of the input, until finally at AIT you activate object memories at the very highest point of the ventral stream. And then in the frontal cortex you can determine what category the stimuli lie in. And you can see in this model, well, two things. First of all, there's no figure ground stage in this model. It's more modern in that way. But secondly, object memories cannot affect what's happening at these lower levels. There are no feedback arrows here. They're just one-way arrows. And this model was 2007 from Sarah et al., including Poggio. But ever since 1991, from the work of Filament and Van Essen, we knew there were feedback connections in the brain. In fact, just about everywhere you see a feed-forward connection, you also see a feedback connection. And certainly, here's the ventral stream in their model. Color coding here is similar to the color coding there. And you see two-way arrows between V1 and V3, V3 and V2, V4 and V3, etc. Lots of feedback connections in the brain. We've known since 1991 that those feedback connections were there. So the first two experiments I want to tell you about are two experiments where we asked directly, are object memories activated before figure assignment happens, before objects are detected? This work was done with Bradley Gibson when he was a grad student in my lab. We had some anomalous results in another experiment that led me to predict that object memories were influencing figure assignment, and so we went in to look at it here. So what we did was we created displays like this, elongated rectangles with an articulated border down the middle. On one side of the border was a portion of a well-known object. We'll call it a familiar object. The other side of the border, there was nothing particularly familiar. It was just the complement of that well-known object. We presented these displays for 86 milliseconds and masked them immediately afterwards and asked our subjects, just press a key to tell us, does the shaped entity lie on the right side of that border or the left side of that border? And our critical region here is shown in black. It was sometimes on the right, sometimes on the left, sometimes black, and sometimes white. We balanced all those things appropriately. And we equated the two sides in area. We attempted across our set to equate the two sides in terms of convexity, but just in case we hadn't managed to equate them in convexity, we didn't compare a subject's likelihood of seeing the figure on the critical side of the border to the complementary side. We compared their likelihood of seeing the figure on the critical side of the border when the stimulus was upright compared to inverted. And when it is inverted, it has all the same features as it does when it's upright. We just argued that it is less familiar because the objects we put into our displays were all objects that have a typical or a canonical upright. That is, they're familiar to you in that orientation, so by rotating them by 180 degrees, they become less familiar. So the question was, are you more likely as a subject to press the button saying the figure lies on the critical side of the border when the displays are upright compared to inverted? And the answer was yes. We had a substantial and significant difference between subjects' likelihood of seeing the figure on the critical side of the border when it depicted an object that has a typical upright in its upright orientation compared to an inverted orientation. So that was the first bit of data that explicitly showed us that object memories, your memory for objects that are familiar to you, that are well known to you, can influence where you see a figure in a display. And these are high-level object memories that are necessarily activated before figure assignment happens. And the fact that we got the orientation effect showed us that the activation of the neurons has to happen quickly, rather than take a long time, because I imagine you all recognize that woman standing on her head, and we submit that happens after figure assignment rather than before figure assignment. We know it takes longer for the populations of neurons that respond to objects for evidence to accumulate for the presence of an object when you misorient that object from its typical upright. And whatever that time is, we were not able to see evidence of familiarity operating when we turn the displays upside down. The next question we asked was, well, what about when there are other Gestalt priors present? Do we see these effects only when the visual system is left with nothing else to rely on? So the Gestalt prior we used was Symmetry. We created, again, two-sided displays with an articulated contour down the middle. One region was symmetric and the other region was asymmetric. We presented them upright and inverted as before, and again asked people to just press a button, tell us which side of the border the shaped entity lies on. These displays were shown for 100 milliseconds. I'm showing you data from that condition. When the displays were inverted, subjects saw the figure on the critical side of the border on only 29% of trials. Well, that's what you would predict, because remember, familiar configuration is reduced in terms of its effectiveness when the displays are inverted, and now we've got symmetry favoring the other side as the figure. So on 71% of the trials, subjects saw the shaped entity on the symmetric side of the border. Yeah?
Which one of those is the entity?
Oh, on the left, you can see it in the shape on the bottom, I hope. On the left is a portion of a seahorse or a carousel horse. We thought of it as a seahorse. Can you see it now?
Sure, but the other one is some sort of, is that just symmetric or like a nightstand or something?
I'm glad you asked that question, because in fact, does anyone else in the room see that as something familiar? Yeah. So one of our subjects said, it looks like somebody with a book open in front of them wearing a graduation cap. Mortarboard, that's the word for that. So we pilot our stimuli, and the ones that we call unfamiliar or meaningless, no more than 25% of subjects agree on what it might represent. So, you see something, someone else might see something else, but that's our meaningless stimulus. The ones that are something familiar, we require more than 75% agreement as to what that object was. Right, so thanks for asking that. Right, so that symmetric region in this case was designed to be unfamiliar or relatively meaningless for most of our subjects. And I think even those of you who have an interpretation, it may be an interpretation that is not reached very quickly by the visual system, but that's a hypothesis. So inverted, only 29% reports that the figure lay on the familiar side of the border. When we turn the displays to upright, we more than doubled the likelihood of subjects seeing the figure lying on the critical familiar side of the border. But you might be thinking there, sitting there thinking, big deal, 59% is not that much higher than chance. And it isn't, it is statistically higher than chance. But this was really interesting to us for a number of reasons. Many people who wanted to leave familiarity out of figure assignment assumed it would always dominate when it was present. These data showed us it does not always dominate. It enters into, if you will, a competition with other priors for figure assignment. So we took these data and a lot of other data we gathered around this time to tell us that, yeah, familiar configuration is a figural prior. It's one of many, it doesn't dominate the others, and it engages in competition with other figural priors that might be favoring the opposite side as a side where a figure lies. In these displays, it won the competition on 59% of the trials. And so the idea is that the winner is what one consciously perceives as the shaped entity, the object in the display. The loser looks like a shapeless background. So our hypothesis based on these data was indeed that there are multiple objects generated to fit borders that are present in the display. And now I want to expand this out across the whole scene. And the brain picks the best one by a process of competition, inhibitory competition. And importantly, that this inhibitory competition happens outside of awareness. So this is a Bayesian process we're talking about here, multiple possibilities generated for a display. I next want to tell you about research asking about whether or not this happens outside of awareness. And I'll tell you about two experiments, first behavioral and second neural evidence. These experiments were conducted with Laura, Drew, and Jay when they were grad students in my lab. To ask this question about awareness, we created a new set of stimuli now. These are closed symmetric regions, so that the Gestalt priors, small area, they were smaller, they were shown one at a time on a screen with a big white area surrounding them. These priors bias subjects to perceive the figure on the inside of these stimuli. But as some of you may have noticed already, there are portions of familiar objects suggested on the ground side of these stimuli, palm trees on the left, Canadian maple leaves in the middle, and table lamps on the right. Now, participants in our experiment were unaware of the stimuli shown on the ground side of the border. They didn't listen to a discussion of figure ground perception and object memories before they participated in our experiment. But let me stop and ask you here. Did any of you see familiar objects suggested on the ground side of the silhouettes I showed you at the very beginning of my talk? Good. The reason I did that was so that you would have had the experience of seeing these displays without my showing you that there are familiar shapes on the outside, so that you could be a bit like the subjects in our experiments. One had a portion of a bell, a Liberty Bell on the outside, and the other one had a portion of a coffee pot on the outside. And so you were not aware of them. They were shown to you briefly, and you were just looking at silhouette objects, which is what the subjects in our experiments are doing. We give them a quite intensive post-experiment questionnaire at the end, where I ask them a question like I just asked you. And if a subject even says yes, and there's a certain demand character in the question, did you see any objects on the outside? If they even say yes, we don't count their data. And we also give them a rating scale to check off objects they did see amid spoils. So we make certain that the data I'm showing you now are from subjects who did not see the shapes on the outside during the experiment. We don't ask them after every trial for obvious reasons. Once I ask you, now you're going to be looking all the time. So, the question we're asking now is, are these object memories activated outside of awareness? The way we address this in the experiment I'll tell you about right now is to give subjects a word categorization task. Is the word you're looking at naming or denoting a natural object or an artificial object in the world? And so before each word came out, they saw a very brief presentation of a silhouette, then a screen that was blank, and then the word came up, and their task was to press a button as quickly and as accurately as they could to categorize that word. We had 3 conditions in this experiment. The shape suggested on the outside of the silhouette that came up before the word either was the same object as denoted by the word, hands there, portions of anchors here in the leftmost column, or it was a different object in the same category, where category is natural or artificial here. Canadian maple leaf before deer, umbrella before scissors. Or it was a different object in a different category, before the word ant, silhouettes with portions of axes shown on the outside, before the word saucepan, silhouettes with portions of the seahorses shown on the outside. And we asked whether or not subjects' reaction times to categorize the words were affected by the relationship between the category of the word and the category of the object suggested on the ground side of the border. The reason that if the possible familiar objects and their semantics are activated before figure assignment, then categorization RTs should show us that case, and in particular, they should be slower when the category of the object activated on the outside of the silhouette shown beforehand is different from the category of the object they have to respond to. Yeah?
So I'm not familiar with this literature. Why is the distinction between like natural and artificial words relevant, or like what's the insight that you went to that sort of?
We looked at the stimuli we had, and half of them were natural objects and half of them were artificial objects. It is the case that in the brain, we know that natural objects tend to be represented near each other and artificial objects tend to be represented near each other, even in the visual cortex. So this is not just a purely semantic distinction, which I was brought up believing it was, but it is sort of instantiated in the visual cortex as well, because the features are quite similar as well. So we were just looking for some semantic categorization task. This one fit our stimuli quite well. The other distinction that's represented in the ventral pathway is living and non-living, but we had a lot more of one than of the other.
So like what a hand does, thank you for that answer, but was like, does a hand count as living?
Well, one reason we didn't do living and non-living is that indeed. A hand is a natural object. An axe is an artificial object, right. So doing living and non-living would probably mean that we'd have to get rid of many of our stimuli for our experiments. But critically, it tells us that the semantics were activated, not just the shape, but the semantics, the category in which the objects lie. So our prediction was slower for the different object, different category case, and indeed they were. So the slowest reaction time was different object, different category, something like the axe before ant. They were slower to words in this condition than to words in either of the two same category conditions. But you're probably wondering, why are they taking longer in the same object case than they are in the different objects same category case? I'm going to ask you to hold on to that wonder for a little while, and I'll answer that question later in my talk with some other data. But you can see that there's evidence here that not only are the shapes themselves activated, but the semantics of those shapes are activated outside of awareness. And we submit before figure assignment because the brain decides that the shaped entity lies on the inside of that border, not on the outside of that border. So now I want to show you some neural evidence consistent with that conclusion. And Jay Sanguinetti participated in this experiment as well as the behavioral experiment. And a colleague of mine, John Allen, who's an expert on ERPs, EEG and ERPs, co-authored it. So for this experiment, we supplemented the silhouettes like the ones you've been looking at until now, novel figures with familiar objects suggested on the outside, with another set of novel figures. These have novel objects suggested on the outside. And we work very hard on these stimuli to make certain that as sets, the features were equated across the two sets of stimuli. Features like the Gestalt properties, like the area of the stimuli, like the articulation of the border, the combination of curved and straight lines, vertical and horizontal spatial frequencies, etc. We matched these as closely as we could because we want to compare what the ERP response is to these two types of objects. For this experiment, we supplemented those silhouettes with silhouettes of real-world objects like a telephone, a turtle, and a clover leaf because, and here we didn't try to equate the features, we're not going to look at responses to those objects very much at all. And I want to point out again that subjects were unaware of the objects suggested on the ground side of the border in this experiment too. So the task here was asking the subjects, we showed the subjects one at a time on the screen for 175 milliseconds and then we masked them immediately afterwards. And we asked subjects, just press a button. Are you looking at a silhouette of a real world object or a novel object? So the real world objects were things like the telephone and the turtle, etc. So correct response to the telephone would be familiar, and correct response to both kinds of novel objects is novel, because we're expecting the brain to determine that the figure lies on the inside of the border. So let's first look at accuracy in this experiment. Yeah. Accuracy was high and equal for the two types of novel silhouettes. They're quite good at saying they're novel, so there's no response interference in this experiment at all. And if anything, they're not as good with the familiar objects as they are with the novel objects. And that's because I think undergraduates today don't know what that first stimulus is on the left. No, seriously. Actually, telephone didn't behave any differently than anything else. But I think it's hard to recognize objects confidently if you only have their outline. So I said we were looking at ERPs in this experiment. We were looking at a repetition paradigm. We were particularly interested in the N300 and 400 ERP. And this is a negative going ERP that is reduced when you repeat a familiar object. So it's called repetition suppression. It's negative going, so if it's reduced in amplitude, that means that the amplitude is reduced here. You'll see the curve closer up to the baseline. This was based on work done by Voss, Shendon, and Paller. I'm not going to show you their results because we replicated their results. I'll just show you our results replicating theirs. So with our familiar objects like the telephone and the turtle, when they were repeated, and that's the red line on this graph, you see a reduction in the amplitude of the N400 ERP response, but you don't see that for the novel figures. And that was the effect that Voss and colleagues had published already.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Very interesting. But it could be that you have sustained activity here, which is not just the N400. If you look at it, this continues all the way to 500 milliseconds.
it doesn't because of the variability. What you can see on the bottom, I didn't point it out, but those black lines along the bottom, that's showing you where in the processing there is a statistically significant difference. And let me come back to the 500 separately. I meant to block that out for here because I want to talk about it a little bit later. I see I didn't accomplish that, but yeah, I'll come back to that. The question we asked was, how about our novel figures with familiar grounds? Do they look like the novel silhouettes? And they do appear novel to the subjects, and they're confidently and accurately saying they're novel. Or do they behave like the familiar silhouettes? Go ahead and vote internally. The data show us they behave like the familiar silhouettes in terms of the ERP response. So out here at 300 to 400 milliseconds post-stimulus onset, we're seeing the reduction in the N300 and 400 response, even though subjects are not consciously aware of the shape on the outside. There is a difference though, and here you notice I did manage to block out that extra indicator of significance. The difference is out there at about 500 milliseconds. It's a late positive response that has been shown to occur when you are aware of the repetition of an object versus not. And here, I think because subjects were aware of the repetition of the familiar objects, we see that late positivity for the familiar figures, but not for the presentation of the novel silhouettes that have familiar figures on the ground side. So that 500 millisecond difference is interesting to us because it is consistent with our claim that subjects are not aware of the shapes on the outside of our silhouettes. So these data are consistent with the claim that these objects are activated before figure assignment. Multiple possible objects are activated in their semantics outside of awareness because subjects were not aware of these familiar shapes on the ground side of the border. Because the stimuli were designed, they were very carefully engineered so that the priors would favor the interpretation of the figure on the inside. Just in case you're wondering, gee, that's kind of late for the visual system to be showing you a difference between these two kinds of stimuli, we also found a difference between the silhouettes with a familiar object on the ground side and the others at around P100, in that the amplitude of P100 was higher when there was a familiar object suggested on the ground side than when there wasn't. And this result was obtained across 3 experiments, some led by Logan Trujillo in my lab before these experiments led by Jay Sanguinetti. And this difference in the ERP was mostly evident over central and right hemisphere leads. At the time, we weren't certain what this P100 difference represented, but we now are fairly certain it represents competition. So let me tell you about that. So we had also hypothesized in this Bayesian model that the possible objects that might be perceived compete with each other. And so now I want to tell you about both neural and behavioral evidence consistent with that claim. I'll start with the neural evidence this time. And this was done with Jay and John, also with Logan Trujillo, who, as I mentioned, was a grad student before Jay in my lab, and David Schneer, his postdoc advisor at UT Austin. So how did we look for evidence of competition? What we reasoned is that if these objects are competing outside of awareness, we should see evidence of more inhibitory competition when subjects are viewing stimuli with familiar objects suggested on the ground side than when they view the matched stimuli that have no familiar objects suggested on the ground side. And we looked at activity in the EEG band, in the alpha band of the EEG response. Activity in the alpha band has been associated with inhibition in many labs. And so we said, well then, when subjects are looking at these stimuli in real time, we ought to see more activity in the alpha band when subjects are viewing our stimuli with familiar configurations suggested on the ground side rather than stimuli without those familiar configurations suggested on the ground side. So we did a time frequency analysis of the results of the experiment I just told you about, and the two other experiments done by Logue and Trujillo. We had a fairly large set of data here. So do we have more power in the alpha band when subjects are looking at the stimuli that we predict should have more competition than the others? And the answer is yes. I don't know if you can see it with the lighting here. This is the novel figure with familiar objects on the ground side. Here's the figure with only novel objects suggested on the ground side. If we turn the lights down even more, you'd be able to see it, but you might fall asleep.
Here on the left side as well, a little better.
Oh, great. Great, of course. There's another screen there. Yeah, you can see it much better in that other screen. And if you can't see that other screen, there's one behind you. Yeah. And so what is shown in the third panel here are the t-values. So yellow indicates a t-value of 9. The dashed blue lines here are indicating for you the lower bound and the upper bound of the alpha oscillations that we were looking at. So this was really nice, we thought, real-time evidence of inhibition going on while subjects are viewing these stimuli. And the difference was centered right about 102 milliseconds in this experiment, right around when that P100 difference was obtained. You know, but it's hard to determine that we have evidence for inhibition when all we have is neural evidence. So we also looked for behavioral evidence. And these experiments were done with Emily Scow. We asked, is there behavioral evidence of competition, perhaps in the form that the responses to the losing objects are slowed, inhibited, suppressed after figure assignment is determined? So here we used a paradigm very similar to the one I showed you with the words. We told subjects, your task concerns a line drawing you're going to see after a stream of images, first a fixation cross, then a silhouette, and then the line drawing. The silhouette, you don't have to pay much attention to it, but it's going to cue you that the line drawing is going to come on soon. Be prepared, make your response as quickly and as accurately as you can. Press a key. Is it a real-world object or a novel object? So here are some samples of the objects we use. For those of you who know Judy Kroll and Molly Potter, these are the Kroll and Potter line drawings from 1984. And subjects simply pressed a key. Am I looking at a real-world object or a novel object? We didn't very much care about those responses to the novel objects. We cared that subjects were accurate because we wanted them to be making a decision here. I'm not going to tell you anything about the responses to those objects, but there was nothing interesting in them. We cared about the responses to the real-world familiar objects. And what we manipulated is whether the silhouette that came up before the line drawing of the object suggested a portion of the same real-world object on the outside of the border, a house on the outside of the border of the silhouette to the left, or didn't. And we asked, if this is inhibitory competition, and the object suggested on the outside of the border loses that competition, can we pick up the fact that of that losing the competition in slowing down of responses to a line drawing that is shown immediately afterwards that depicts the same object? So it's almost like negative priming if you think about it, although I don't love that term. So evidence that it is inhibitory competition would be found in longer RTs when a line drawing follows a silhouette depicting the same object on the ground side. And notice it's the same basic level object. It's not the identical object. We wanted to be certain we weren't picking up just inhibition of border assignment. So we wanted to change the borders somewhat. And what we found was, indeed, in the black bars here, when the familiar object suggested on the ground side was the same as the object that was shown to them almost immediately afterwards in line drawing form, the reaction times were quite a bit substantially and significantly longer than when the same line drawing followed a silhouette with a novel object suggested on the ground side. And here we tried to match the silhouettes in terms of curvilinearity and rectilinearity and such features. We took these data as evidence for inhibitory competition, but I want to point out that we found these effects only if we had a very short stimulus onset asynchrony between the silhouette and the line drawing. It had to be less than 100 milliseconds, and only in subjects' fastest reaction times. So we did a split on their RTs only if they responded quickly. So this tells us that you might be able to look at a stimulus over here that had a portion of a familiar object that lost the competition for favor assignment, but if you move your eyes and look at that object again, you're not going to be delayed in seeing that object. It's a short-lived suppression of the response to the object. So now I'm telling you about a suppression of the response to the object qua shaped object. Now I want to ask you to think back to the data I showed you before when I was having subjects respond about the category of the word that came up immediately afterwards. And remember, somewhat surprisingly, subjects' reaction times were longer in the same object condition than in the different objects' same category condition. And we think the reason is that the shape is suppressed for a short period of time after it loses competition. The semantics are not suppressed, but the semantics writ large are not suppressed, but the shape is suppressed. And shape is a central part of the semantics that have to do with house or seahorse. Shape is part of semantics. It's not just disembodied cognition. The shape is very much a part of it. So I think what we're picking up here is that suppression of the shape right in the center of the category house or hand. And here, when you have a different object but the same category, there is no suppression of the shape in the center of the category. That's a hypothesis that bears investigation. We haven't investigated it yet. So what's the summary so far? We have evidence that multiple objects are activated outside of awareness. And before an object is detected, their semantics are activated as well. Those objects engage in inhibitory competition, and the response to the losing object is suppressed for a short period of time. This is a Bayesian model of perception, and there is a hierarchical Bayesian model of perception that was proposed by Mumford and by his student Leon Mumford many years ago. And this is the hierarchical model of perception I prefer because it makes contact with what's going on in the brain. Similar to what I've been saying, they argue that multiple potential scene interpretations are activated before objects are perceived consciously, and these possible objects seek confirmation in lower levels of the visual system, and they compete with each other along the way, all the way down the visual hierarchy. And this theory uses the feedback connections in the brain. And finally, the best interpretation is perceived as a function of this competition. So I'm going to show you a toy model of a predictive processing implementation of a hierarchical Bayesian model, like the one that was proposed by Mumford and Lee. So this is a toy model in many ways. One is that there are only 3 levels of the visual system. So we're going from low levels here up to highest levels, so the highest of the 3 levels. Predictions are running from higher levels to lower levels, and the notion is that predictions generated in high levels are tailored to the lower level activity, to the activity of the next lowest level in the visual cortex. The prediction units are now known to be in the deep layers of the cortex, layers 5 and 6. The units that receive the predictions are in the superficial layers of the cortex. So the idea is that the predictions are sent to lower levels from right in this display to left. And then the goodness of the match is indicated by a prediction error that is sent forward in the visual system. So low activity is sent forward if the prediction is matched, high activity if the prediction is mismatched. But then this is a cascading process, so there's adjustment of the prediction and reapplication. application of the prediction all the way along the visual pathway. And it is a cascading process, so you don't have to finish the processing at one level before the processing at another level is underway, as McClellan and Remmelhart taught us a long time ago. So the last experiment I want to tell you about is one where we asked whether or not we could get any evidence for this predictive processing in the perception of our stimuli. So going a little bit farther than we've gone before. And we reasoned like this. We said, well, for the stimuli I've been showing you all along, where there's a portion of a familiar object suggested on the ground side, if we could look at prediction errors somehow, just on the ground side of our silhouettes, which is what we did, what we would predict is that here there are high-level representations that are activated for the portions of the shapes on the outside there, and the predictions are sent to lower levels. Those predictions are going to be matched, at least at the outset and at least right there close to the border of the silhouettes. So there's going to be low prediction error for those stimuli. Some error, because you've never seen that particular seahorse before or that particular house before, but low error because the predictions pretty much match the stimulus. For the novel objects that suggest a novel object on the ground side, these are articulated borders as well. They can be partitioned into parts. We hypothesized that they also attempt to activate high-level memories, and some of you could see those shapes as familiar to something or another, but the match is going to be quite poor. Those predictions are going to have to be revised. There's going to be high prediction error for those stimuli. So this is a very recent experiment. This is under review right now. Laura Kashimani is now a professor in California, Cal Poly State in San Luis Obispo. And Rachel and Colin are grad students in my lab right now. Diana was a superb undergraduate in my lab who is very involved in research. So we asked, are we going to see lower bold activation in fMRI in low levels of the visual cortex when subjects view the stimuli with portions of familiar objects suggested on the ground side compared to stimuli that have novel objects suggested on the ground side? If so, that would be evidence consistent with the predictive processing model and might tell us something about feedback all the way down to the early visual cortex in our stimuli. What we did in this experiment was we presented the stimuli in the upper right visual field. We used color versions of the stimuli on a black background, and we gave subjects a RSVP task at fixation, really just a cover task. Look at this rapidly changing stream of letters and alphanumeric characters and press a button whenever you see a lowercase m. And so they were monitoring this. The stimuli were very small. They had to keep their eyes foveate that stimulus stream in order to be relatively accurate on this task. And the stimuli were presented in the upper right visual field for 250 milliseconds each and jittered in terms of the delay between one stimulus and another. Subjects were told to ignore the stimuli in the upper right visual field. We blocked the stimulus type because we really had no idea what we were going to find, so we didn't use a trial-dependent measure. We used a block measure. So what you see here is a block of stimuli, all of which have familiar configurations suggested on the ground side. There were other blocks with stimuli with novel configurations suggested on the outside. So let's take a look at what we predicted. We added a control stimulus as well, with simply straight edges equal in area to the other stimuli. They were all equal in height, and these were equal not in area, equal in width to the stimuli with the articulated borders. And we reasoned, if we were going to look for evidence of prediction error driving response in the low levels of the visual system, we would expect the lowest error here. And remember, we're looking at the ground side, very close to the border. I can tell you how we did that in post-experiment questions if you're interested, but we did some functional localizers, and we're looking at only the ground side. We expected very low error here because it's not an articulated border. You can't fit many other objects on the outside of that display. So it's going to be a good match to whatever rectangular annulus you might try to fit on the outside there. We expected the next lowest error for the stimuli with familiar shapes suggested on the ground side, as I described before, and the highest error of all for stimuli with novel objects suggested on the ground side. For the reasons I mentioned before, these are articulated borders. They are likely activating object memories that cannot be fit well by these stimuli. So, why is my slide not advancing? Okay, I got it now. I know why. I hid something and it required three presses to get it to go. Okay, here are the data. Here are the early visual areas. The three types of stimuli: gray are our control stimuli, orange are our stimuli with the familiar configurations on the outside, and blue are our stimuli with nothing familiar suggested on the outside. And what you can see in these early visual areas is activity of the sort you would predict if predictive processing is going on. That is, the activity in the lower level visual areas is reflecting the amount of work that needs to be done to correct the prediction based on the error that comes in from the stimulus. So these data are under review right now. So we take this as fMRI evidence of prediction error in V1 through V4. There are some other conditions I can tell you about and other considerations if you're interested in the post-experiment questions. We also asked, okay, it's the low-level visual regions. Is there any evidence that it is feedback per se? And so Laura did some Granger causality modeling, and what she found was that activity in V2 on the ground side of the border is predicted by activity in the perirhinal cortex. And we have other evidence published in 2012 that the perirhinal cortex is involved in effects of past experience on figure assignment. I didn't want to tell you about another 2 or 3 experiments in my talk today, but I'd be happy to tell you about it if you're interested afterwards. So we had lots of reasons to be predicting that the perirhinal cortex would be involved. This was long thought to be just a memory structure, but recent work out of Oxford and NIH, as well as the University of Toronto, has shown that the perirhinal cortex is involved in perception. It's not just a memory structure. So we have evidence for feedback in the Granger causality analysis as well. So I presented to you across all these experiments evidence for predictive processing in a dynamic, interactive, hierarchical Bayesian system. Multiple possible objects and their semantics are activated before we perceive objects, before objects are detected. This happens outside of awareness. These generate predictions that are matched to lower level activity, and this prediction error can be measured. And these hypotheses about what objects might be present engage in inhibitory competition. The winner is perceived, the loser is not. So let's come back to the opening question. I've long argued that figure ground perception is an outcome. It's not a stage of processing. It's not a process. If you listen, you'll hear people saying the figure ground process. It's not a process. It's just one outcome of a hierarchical Bayesian perceptual system. And so in the end, even though I have been working on figure ground perception for a lot of my career, I want to be the first one to tell you that figure ground perception is not special. The visual system has to decide whether to assign the border to be a bounding contour of an object or not. That is happening all over your visual field. The decision made at this border is determined by the decision made at that border, and so on. A hierarchical, an interactive hierarchical Bayesian model is the way to think about figure ground perception, and about perception in general. Thank you. Thank you for listening, and thanks for your comments.
We have time for questions, beginning with student questions first.
Yeah.
So earlier, towards the beginning, I think it was in stage 3, you mentioned something about that one of the theories thinks that there are too many options to be computable. And I was just wondering if you, like, what is what's the amount of things? I mean, is it assuming that the brain has to compute all of the possible options? Or I guess what I'm getting at is, like, in most neural networks, like, you know, you end up with like a single winner, or like an output that has
Winner take all, yeah.
Right.
Uh-huh.
If that's how you design it. I mean, there are some papers from like 10 or 15 years ago that show that you can design a neural network to give you not just a single winner, but you have to implement specific, like, you know, voting rules in the network for that to happen. But I guess I'm just wondering about, you know, what's the scope of like the reasonability of projecting something that's too computationally hard when, like, do you have to assume that all of the things are processed by the brain, or that, like, there's just some, you know, rank order thing where, you know, we only possibly could even perceive the top few anyways because of the time constraints?
Time constraints are important because if you think of a network that is implementing predictions and revisions of those predictions via prediction error, it's going to take some time. So there's so many answers to your question. It's really a good discussion point. We know that it takes time to perceive a scene. We have no introspection about this. So you open your eyes in the morning and you perceive your room, or wherever you are. You know, sometimes you don't, right? And you say, where am I? But mostly if you're in a place that you know full well, you open your eyes and you perceive just fine. We have no introspection to the fact that it takes time for visual perception to be generated. There's a beautiful paper by Peterson, and Eagleman is the first author on it, showing that at least for a motion paradigm that they were looking at, imagine a stimulus rotating around a clock face array, and somewhere in its rotation a bar comes on, let's say at 9 o'clock. And your task is to state whether or not the bar came on right when that light moving around was at the same point, or whether it came on afterwards. They have some beautiful data showing that in that task, perception is lagged by 80 milliseconds from when the stimulus came on. Now, does that apply to every kind of perception? I don't think so. I think it probably depends upon the amount of time it takes to resolve any competition that might be going on. But, you know, you never open your eyes and sit there for a while thinking, what am I seeing, right? So you see something right away. You get an interpretation quickly. Is there a limit to the number of objects that could be activated? Some people have asked me, with respect to my results, whether or not I can have evidence of the object on the outside of the border being activated, only just in case there's only one stimulus on the screen. What if there are 2 stimuli on the screen? Well, we have it with 2 stimuli on the screen as well. And some of the computational modelers who said, no, you can't do this, were stunned. That we could show evidence that for 2 silhouettes, one above and one below fixation, objects on the ground side of both silhouettes were activated. Is there a limit? Personally, I don't think so. I mean, if you think of any scene we look at, where like this complex scene, we have some other work showing that the context very much determines what you will perceive. And so if the brain is going to take the context into consideration, it's going to be considering interpretations for a border here based on the broader context. The computational argument that there's got to be some limit on the number of objects that can be activated, I think doesn't take into consideration the speed of the visual system, the fact that the visual system can have very fast access to object memories and very fast iterative correction of predictions and so on. We have no idea how long it takes some recent evidence I was just trying to tell Michael about before suggests to us that if you give the brain an additional 10 milliseconds, it can resolve some of the iterative processing. So if you give it 100 milliseconds, it can resolve some of the iterative processing it can't resolve in 90 milliseconds. So that's interesting, but we need to do that work. And I think computational reasoning is invaluable. In fact, collaborating with somebody who does Bayesian modeling changed the way I think about things. It's invaluable. But I don't think an argument that says that's computationally too intensive for the brain can fly. I think we have to see what the brain can do and then maybe create the models to show us how the brain is doing that. So I don't know what the limitations are, and it remains to be seen. So let's put up 8 objects in the scene and see if we can find evidence that the shapes on the ground side of all 8 of them were activated. And when they're in the periphery, of course, it's harder to activate them because they're not central vision and so on. Yeah. Yeah.
Just to kind of wrap my head around how you open
Sorry, how I opened my talk?
Okay. Zebras. So
Yeah.
you put this in like a lived life sort of experience of like how to solve this, like almost anticipatory. I'm wondering how, like, maybe that clock example that we had, that Eagleman study that you're talking about, is just we're lagging 80 milliseconds behind our perception of the events. How does a lion, I guess, solve that problem? Because it's like if you're 80 milliseconds behind, that's the difference between you maybe eating or not.
That's a really good question. And I think predictive processing is probably the way, right? So the lion sees some differentiation in one and may leap toward that one. And whether or not the lion catches its prey is another thing altogether, right? So lions are not successful every time they go to catch a prey. No, but that's a very, very interesting question. So I'm going to assume the lion's visual system works the same way ours does, the monkey's does, and the cat does, more or less. Little lions. So that may be partly why they're not successful all the time. Did any of you see the picture in the newspaper maybe a couple of weeks ago about this really cute zebra that was born with spots? Oh, it was in the New York Times. Did you see that? And I just thought, oh, that zebra's not going to live very long because it is not going to be camouflaged by the rest of the herd. I felt really sorry for it. It was cute, but I knew it wasn't going to live very long. No, so that's a really good question. And maybe, does the place where the lion aims on the zebra help it to at least pull that one down so that it can kill its prey? Yeah, important, good question.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, it's just like where would the anticipation of like future events be put into a predictive processing area like this?
Yeah, I think it ought to be able to be put in there pretty readily. So let me spin for a little bit. There's been some evidence, this is from Jennifer Fry's lab many years ago, called representational momentum. If you were, so almost the same thing that Eagleman and colleagues are looking at, if you're rotating or if someone is shown and falling down and you ask people to remember the exact last screen they saw, if you cut it off mid-process, people always remember shifted forward in the movement cycle. Yeah, so, and that's a great example of predictive processing in vision. If you go back and you look at a lot of the old data, I think once you have a theory like predictive processing, you can unify things that were not necessarily unified. They were thought of something, oh, representational momentum, isn't this interesting and cute? I don't remember any deep theory behind. There was a lot of work done in representational momentum by many people, and then it just dropped, probably because it wasn't consistent with a unified theory. Well, that's my guess. Betances, did I got it right? Oh, I'm sorry, Beethoven's.
I had a question about your hierarchical Bayesian model. You wanted to show us the simplified one. So you made the choice not to include a second order influence about the level of confidence about prediction error.
this is a great question, and it has to be included. So because I didn't want to complicate things too much, and I didn't know how sophisticated you are, people in this audience, about these models, it's not just prediction and error, it's also some estimate of the precision of the prediction compared to the bottom-up input. And like any Bayesian model, you're going to weight prediction and input differentially as a function of your confidence in the two signals. Yeah, it has to be taken into consideration, absolutely. As I understand the precision in hierarchical models, it depends upon the precision across a number of different spatial locations. So you look at the whole population of neurons that are giving you bottom-up input and they're giving you prediction. Yeah, so this has to be modeled, and it has to be modeled with the precision in the model as well, absolutely. Yeah.
So in all of your objects, the output of the emotions was pretty much completely removed.
Mm-hmm.
Was that deliberate? It's probably deliberate. Was it to reduce the noise in the model?
It wasn't deliberate because I didn't say this in my talk, but one reason we went to making the stimuli unconscious is that many critics were originally saying, well, look, you think your subjects are giving you a figure ground decision in those first two experiments I told you about, where people were reporting where the figure lay with respect to the border. But in fact, they've noticed a couple of familiar objects, and now they've changed their task set, and they're not telling you about what they see as the shaped entity first. They're looking for a familiar object. And so maybe your data don't tell us anything about activation of object memories before figure assignment. People are flipping the figure assignment in order to give you the response they think you want. So we just kept working with that set of stimuli, and as I said in response to the question from the man behind you, we could ask questions about semantics with them. We can ask questions about prediction error with them. If we were to have some of them more tied to emotions than others, it would be very interesting to see how that changes processing. I can tell you that we've looked at value. This is some work jointly done with colleagues in Australia when I was on sabbatical there in 2017. With those original stimuli I showed you, let's see if I can show you this just quickly. Can't do it quickly. Let me do that. Oh, I'll just try to draw pictures in the air. So imagine I have a novel object, and I familiarize you with this object. It's a symmetric object, symmetric around a vertical axis. Two sides are exactly the same. And I teach you that if you pick one of them, you get 80% probability of reward, and the other one only 20% probability of reward, two different objects. But one of them is created as the complement to the other. So I want you to now imagine the Rubin vase faces. So you know the vase suggests two faces on the outside, but you wouldn't think the faces were similar in shape to the vase at all. Correct? Are you following me here? So subjects were seeing one of these shapes as 80% probability of reward, and the other one as 20% probability of 90 and 10 is what we did. 90% probability of reward and 10% probability of reward. And then we gave them one of the bipartite stimuli with a singular border down the middle that depicted the 80% probability of reward on one side, 90% probability of reward on one side, and the 10% probability of reward on the other. Is there a whiteboard here that I can draw on? I see there's a whiteboard. I can tell that my drawing of pictures in the air has become totally incomprehensible after a while. It's going to be a long way of telling you we got no effects of value on figure assignment. But it would be...
One of these should work.
Thank you.
Okay, first try.
Yeah. So imagine you learn that this stimulus is 90% probability of reward. And now I'm going to try to draw the same stimulus here, but And this one is only 10% probability of reward. But this is the complement of that. Can you see they would fit together as puzzle pieces? So then, if at test, and we gave subjects many, many trials, we knew they had learned this reward structure extremely well, and then at test, we gave them one of the black and white displays with the border that's shared by the two of them, and we asked subjects brief mass exposure, which side looks like it was figure. And we expected that if reward value influenced figure assignment, they should see the figure on the side of the border that depicts that stimulus more often than the side of the border that predicts the 10% reward stimulus. We didn't get it. We tried many times. We did a Bayesian analysis of the results, and we are pretty confident that these null results are there. We also, this was reward, we also did a loss version of this. We didn't find it for value. The question is, would we find it for emotion? I don't know. It's a good question. So we just haven't asked that question yet. I think we would have to, like in this experiment, start with stimuli that are novel to begin with, because your emotional response to one of my stimuli is probably not particularly high. I don't know how you feel about table lamps, or axes, or seahorses, or whatever else we have. We have about 40 of these stimuli. We would probably have to train people. And one thing I didn't mention was when we trained people on this reward structure, we made certain they had equal exposures to these two. And it was 600 exposures to them. So we maxed out on familiar shape. And then we didn't find any evidence of value over and above that effect of familiar shape, which is equal for the two sides.
What if, for this case, instead of just assigning numbers of values to them, what if you can assign emotional values to them? For example, on the left, you assign an angry face for 10 milliseconds when you're training them, and you assign the happy face with the right stimulus. Do you think that will make a difference? Is that a valid approach?
I think it's a valid approach. I think it's a great experiment. Yeah, it would be very interesting to look at that. I'm going to try to take you back in the history of psychology and the history of cognitive psychology. There's a time in the 1950s where there was a new look school of psychology. And Schaefer and Murphy published a paper in 1954 where they took a stimulus like this, and they just put a border down the middle like that. And they put an eye on this side there, and an eye on that side there. And let's call this Fred. And now I want to call it Ginger. They didn't do Fred and Ginger. They showed these faces to subjects separated out. They never at first showed them to them sharing a central border. And they would reward them whenever they got Ginger, a penny, and penalize them a penny whenever they got Fred. And then they put them together without the eyes in this display and asked people, where does the figure lie with respect to the border? And they found an effective reward, that subjects were more likely to report the figure on the side that had been rewarded rather than the other side, and they balanced and so on. They did all of that appropriately. But then came the backlash to the new look in psychology, and there was a huge backlash. And people set out to fail to replicate this. Among them, my advisor, Julian Hochberg. And he used electric shock. He didn't use reward. He shocked them whenever they saw Fred, and I guess didn't shock them whenever they saw Ginger. And they could back in those days. The subject sports would allow them to, although people are doing some of that work now too. And then he put, so this is interesting to me just when you think about the history of psychology, and I have an article from 1999 on this. He put the two faces together. And lo and behold, he replicated Schaefer and Murphy with one version of Fred. I don't know which one, but one. But not with the other. So when he balanced, if he averaged over the two, he had the effect that Schaefer and Murphy reported. But they couldn't say they had it for regardless of which side was Fred. And so then they did a last experiment where they said to subjects, well, the test displays here were on for 1 second. That's a very long time for the visual system and a very long time for figure assignment. So they asked their subjects, do you have enough time to reverse the displays in 1 second? I want to show you a display that's up for a second, and now tell me if you can reverse it in that period of time. And the subjects said yes, they could, and therefore they concluded, therefore the original results required a reversal of the first percept. And that stood. I think Hochberg's study was 57 or 60, something like that. That stood for a very long time. And needless to say, my graduate advisor didn't like my results when I first started publishing them, but I wasn't in grad school anymore. Did this come from you? Thanks a lot.
So could people actually rotate those things, or were they just saying?
Well, back in the, I think they can, because a second is a very, very long period of time. In fact, we've run some experiments where we have a display up for a long period of time and subjects are reporting reversals. Sometimes they can do a reversal in 300 milliseconds or so. Sometimes it takes longer than that because there's a certain dynamics to the reversals as a function of what else is going on. So I think they could, but by the way, it wasn't the same subjects. It was a different set of subjects, and they were just asked, can you reverse in this period of time? And they said yes.
I guess I was just wondering if it was in any way related to some of the Sloman stuff on the knowledge illusion. You ask people, do you know how a toilet works, and they say yes, and you ask them to tell you how it works, and they have no idea.
I press the button and
Yeah.
it works. Yeah. No, I think they could. I have no reason to question that they could because I have plenty of evidence that they reverse, even quite complicated displays in less than a second. Yeah. But, the nature of the evidence we look for has gotten different over time, and the field has been moving forward. We were talking about that at lunch a little bit. Our techniques change, our methods change. We don't rely on a different group of subjects telling us whether or not they can reverse anymore. And we couldn't find effects of value, which was close to what Schaefer and Murphy had done originally. But, there are a lot of conditions we didn't run, and we could have run. So as I said, we compared 90% likelihood of reward against 10% likelihood of reward. What if we had compared 90% likelihood of reward against 90% likelihood of loss of stimulus? It would have been a bigger difference. What if we hadn't trained them on 600 trials beforehand to really max out the familiarity component, and maybe we just can't see any effect on the back of that 600 trial learning? We just wanted to be certain that they had learned the contingencies before we tested them. So there's a lot of other experiments about value that could be done, but lots of experiments about emotion. And I like the pairing idea that you came up with. I think it's a really good idea.
I was just wondering if those experiments, the ones that you've done about value and perhaps to do about emotion, are those, to you, are those like binned in, what am I trying to ask? Like in the case of emotion, for example, it seems almost like, I'm not trying to use this word because you've used it, but like it seems more like a protected values sort of thing versus like a consequentialist approach. So like if you're telling someone you're going to get more money for this, there's sort of like a consequence that they can start to incorporate or maybe incorporate into their decision. Whereas in the case of emotion, I mean, maybe they're thinking about that, but it's I think usually more interpreted in the frame of there are certain like ways I react, and I'm just going to protect those ways. Does that distinction make a difference to you, or do you think that you could just sort of pull around the space of different effects that might impact this?
I think the distinction you're talking about is a very interesting one. I haven't thought in those terms, but it is a very interesting one. The way I've thought about it is this, that for visual perception, the evidence that value has an influence, it's all visual search. And value has an influence on what you attend to in visual search. And so attention seems to go first to the most highly valued stimulus in an array. There's very little evidence that attention a priori affects figure assignment. The one experiment that's out there, I don't think is done very well. And so maybe value affects attentional allocation, but maybe attentional allocation doesn't influence figure assignment. I don't know. I think, again, there's a lot of work that can be done here. And this paper is in progress, being written up now. And I hope there are a lot of follow-ups to this paper where people get challenged by the idea that value can't affect figure assignment, and we'll see what comes of it. And I think asking about emotion separately from value is good because it's just money that we're talking about. By the way, the subjects actually were rewarded in these experiments, and so it wasn't just the illusion of value that was being manipulated here. Yeah, but I think these questions are interesting. Yeah.
So the Granger causality stuff with cranial cortex and a bunch of other stuff in the literature, I think is convincing that there are these top-down effects. But if you go back to an answer you gave right around when you were talking about experiment to one of Jordan's questions about how there are relationships between the distribution of low-level features and these semantic categories, right? From an information theoretic point of view, all of that information about semantics has to be there in the lower level features. And you can imagine with a lot of exposure to various kinds of visual objects that a lot could be learned in terms of cooperation and competition at a low level of representation that could capture some of the effects that you showed, that you labeled as semantic.
Thank you for asking
Right.
that question.
So I guess the question is, if I really believe that there are top-down effects, but there could be these kind of effects at a lower level of representation, how do we tease out where the effects are coming from, or how much of the effects are coming from one place or another?
It's a great question, and we attempted to do that. So let me show you the study where we attempted to do that. Let me just find it here. Okay. So the first study we published was in 2012, and we only used upright stimuli, and I think it was very susceptible to the criticism you're making. And you could make it this way. You could say, well, look, if you have a portion of a natural object on the outside, then the borders of the silhouette are themselves more curvilinear than if you have an artificial object on the outside. So these data aren't necessarily evidence that an object has been activated on the outside and its semantics have been activated. So for this experiment, Laura Kashimani was the lead on this one. We didn't use the same object condition, we just used the same category versus different category condition. And we presented the silhouettes both upright and inverted, arguing that all of those features that can be ascribed to the inside as well as to the objects suggested on the outside are there in both orientations. But going back to the very early results I showed you, the population of neurons that respond to the familiar known configurations, it takes longer for them to cross threshold if you give a misoriented version of the display. So we predicted we wouldn't find the semantic priming effects in the inverted displays. And that's indeed what we got. Let me just show you this. My computer is complaining. Okay. So upright, again, the results I showed you before, faster reaction times for same category than for different category, inverted, no significant difference between the two. So yes, indeed, we had to do that experiment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because these are, loose ends that have to be tied up, but I wanted to tell you all about so much, I didn't want to tie them all up during the talk. Yeah. Other questions, thoughts? Ramesh?
So I was wondering, so it's really fascinating that there are these feedback projections from higher levels of the visual system. Most of them you were referring to are up the sort of ventral stream. Mm-hmm. I was just wondering what's going on in terms of possibilities for action and things in the dorsal stream that might interfere with something like this, which sort of gets at the line chasing the zebra question, right? Which is really far more of a dorsal thing, where detecting these edges is probably going to be very critical for those kinds of things. Right? So I'm imagining that there are also such connections available from, say, maybe parietal areas down to lower levels of the visual system. I was just wondering if you could comment on things like that.
I would love to brainstorm with you about this. I've tried to think about it. How could I get action into my experiments? I'd love to be able to do it. I haven't been able to figure out a way to do it. So we know there are connections, from the dorsal stream to the ventral stream. And so if we're thinking of an interactive visual system, we ought to be able to see their effects on object detection as I have manipulated it. And one thing I like about object detection as I've manipulated it in terms of figure assignment is that most people would agree that that is an output that happens very early in the course of processing. And I think our orientation effect confirms that, because there isn't time for the population of neurons to be activated above threshold if you slow down that activation by misorienting the stimulus. Are the connections from the dorsal stream there fast enough to influence object detection? I would expect so, but how do we go about looking at it? Ideas, thoughts, potential collaborations. I'd love to see if we could brainstorm about that. People jumping for something or reaching for something. I mean, babies, one way you know what babies see in front is they will reach for whatever they perceive as closer. But that would just be another way of measuring figure assignment. Could that somehow be incorporated into an experiment looking at figure assignment with respect to a border? I'd love to brainstorm about it, but I find myself not getting anywhere when I try to think about it.
This is a really random idea I just thought of right now, but I wonder if there's a way where you could use kind of a virtual reality system in a reaching task and basically present these figures around, I guess different objects that may be more or less manipulable, or maybe an object, the figure is an object that requires grabbing it like this versus the ground is an object that requires grabbing it in a different way.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
And doing something with virtual reality in that way.
Yeah, that's very interesting to think about. Yeah.
I just thought of it right now. So
No, it's very interesting. And the other thing that I've thought of, which is somewhat similar to manipulations, Michael is using, and I think maybe a student in your lab too may be using with him. We used to try to figure out a way to have subjects move a mouse toward an X. A house, let's say, and there would be a house in one quadrant and a silhouette with a portion of a house on the outside in another quadrant, and see if subjects, if you have them competing with each other, are just taking longer to move their mouse toward the one that depicts a house. But that simply also tells us you could pick up this activation in a motor response. It doesn't tell us that motor responses are involved in the decision. And what we could do with your idea, if we could think of the stimulant, would be to maybe habituate you to this motion and then see that maybe that motion would be more likely to drive figure assignment. That would be really interesting. I think we'd have to work really hard to equate the factors on both sides of the border in order to look at this, but as I'm thinking about it, it could be done. Yeah, that would
Put
be
lines
interesting.
into the VR.
What's what?
Lines in VR to make a beautiful skate with secrets.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, we should say thank you to Professor Peterson for the talk.
Best audience I've ever had in terms of thoughtful questions. Thank you.
So, thank you. That was fascinating.
Okay.
So I was actually back in the dorsal stream.